The Spin-off Podcast Network. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai hoki mai ki a The Fold e mihi ne ko Duncan Grieve tōku ingoa. I'm here on my own, monopoding, as I do occasionally, to talk about two things, the two huge media stories that have engulfed the world over the past week. The first of which was the Netflix result, which sent its share price cratering and a bit of a chill through the whole streaming universe and everything it touches, which is pretty much everything in the media when you really think about it. And the second of which is Elon's acquisition of Twitter, which is just an extraordinary story by any means. And what I also want to do is basically this genre where it's just me running into the studio with a head full of thoughts to talk about a breaking media story is something that I'm going to try and do a little bit more of going forward. Just sort of 15, 20 minutes, if I can stretch to that, and very much unfiltered, raw thoughts. But we'll just see how it goes. It won't be for everyone, but maybe it's for you. So I'll start off talking about Netflix. I actually wrote a piece about this, which is on the Spin-off right now. So maybe check that out. But I think it's really important. It's a huge story to me. Netflix has been. It's a pretty extraordinary company. It has been a real pioneer, a very cerebral, and I think significant company in the technology space. It started out, 20 odd years ago, shipping DVDs to you via the mail, and it was, its chief competition at the time was Blockbuster, and the innovation it had was, there were no late fees. Late fees were, these things. If you're younger, you'll be like, what were late fees? And then you would go and you'd rent your five videos or DVDs for $10, and then you'd forget to return them. And when you next went in to try and get some more DVDs on another like hungover Saturday or whatever, you'd have like $30 or $40 of fines that you'd have to clear or sort of start paying down before you could get more. They were a real pain in the ass, but that was why Blockbuster and all those other DVD rental chains were so profitable. And Netflix's innovation was keep them as long as you want, but we won't send you any more until you've returned those others. So you'd have this list of titles that you wanted to watch, and just send them back by mail when you wanted the next ones when you got through them. And that was actually a really, really, I think, very, very clever idea. It sort of took away the need for stores. It took away something that was a real annoyance for consumers. And the fact is that was in the early 2000s, and they could already see that there was trouble coming. And rather than sort of do what most media companies do and aggressively defend their ground, they went ahead and kind of effectively disrupted themselves, almost to the point where they considered breaking off their old company and starting a fresh one. But they didn't do that. What they did was incubate and ultimately start a streaming service under the same name, Netflix, where they basically took advantage of a brief period of time when all of the TV networks, which were hugely profitable, often had deals through cable, so they had advertising income. They also had income through the cable companies. And Netflix comes up to them and goes, "Well, why don't you let us stream your shows online for a relatively small fee?" And they're like, "Cool, just put that straight on my bottom line, thanks." And so they started out, streaming shows like Friends or The Office, and developed quite a big customer base that way. Then when those TV companies started to realize that, they sort of signaled to Netflix that they would end that eventually. But that eventually took a long time. As recently as a year or two ago, they were still selling some of their most high-profile properties to Netflix, even as they were building out their own streaming platforms. And Netflix, again, saw which way the wind was blowing and created House of Cards and Orange is the New Black, these two very successful and specific and high-profile series, and then they dropped them all at once, another innovation. The point being that this is a company that has always innovated within television and within streaming, and that it, in doing that, it basically created this aura around it that it was kind of immune to the forces which bedeviled or, kind of made the rest of the television media kind of a bit humdrum and, a sort of a known quantity. And as a result, it became this incredibly beloved consumer brand because along with all of that, Netflix just worked, in a place where, if you're someone with low data coverage or whatever device you're on, Netflix just works. They've always had this ability to attract the best engineers. They wrote a whole book called No Rules Rules about their sort of, strange, again, innovative workplace culture. They devolve power. They have a very flat hierarchical structure. They basically tried to have like a beginner's mindset to everything they did. And Reed Hastings and Ted Serenados, the two of the leads there, have really moved this whole industry forward and created a whole category to the point where they used to talk about, until very recently, about FAANG stocks, FAANG. And that stood for Facebook, which is now called Meta, Alphabet, Amazon. The N was Netflix and the G was Google. And now things have changed. Like now Microsoft would naturally be among them, and Apple is now valued at 30 times what Netflix is currently valued at. But that tells you what that basket of technology stocks, they were all considered innovators, and they were all considered they were broadly similarly valuable. And the fact that Netflix, which had basically one single income stream, subscriptions to its service, was considered to sit alongside all of those giants really tells you something about how that company was perceived. And what's happened now? I mean, well, a lot of that value was predicated on the idea that it would grow forever. And it did for almost all of the last decade. Every time it would beat analysts' expectations, its share price would grow. It came out with hit after hit after hit. And, it talked about its biggest competitor being sleep, and its next biggest being Fortnite. Like it really went out of its way to position itself as not part of that scrum of other media companies, your Disneys and your HBOs and so on, but to be a sort of a thing unto itself. And it set its aspirations on 500 million customers or 1 billion customers. These just phenomenal numbers. And on some level, that really expensive stock price or the market capitalization was predicated on the idea that it would one day reach those numbers. And we've now had 2 consecutive quarters where it's had a really disappointing result. The most recent, it actually shrunk. And the idea of a company like Netflix shrinking is basically what that says to the market is like, maybe it's at its ceiling. Maybe any growth from here on in will be very slow and incremental. Maybe as the streaming market grows, we now have HBO Max and Disney Plus and, a revitalized Hulu and, there are just more businesses, more big streaming platforms launching all the time. That the idea that Netflix will naturally achieve its targets is now open to question. And as a result, a company that was worth $300 billion as recently as November is now worth less than $100 billion. And why is that significant? Who cares about the price of it? Well, on some level, that really impacts Netflix's ability to to grow into the company that it desires, that it wants to be. Why is that? A lot of the employees are compensated in stock options, i.e. the ability to buy shares at a particular price. Now, if your stock options are at a particular level and the company's share price is trading way above that, you feel rich. When the share price craters and your stock options are above the price that the shares are trading at, those options are worthless. You're never going to cash them in. The ability to buy a share at $120 when the shares are $100. And so all of these amazingly talented software engineers that Netflix has always been able to go out and recruit, they're suddenly in play for all of the other places that they can ply their trade. So, it's just a really big culture shock to the industry. And so Netflix, which has always said we're different, we're not going to have advertising like everyone else, suddenly said, we're probably going to have advertising in the next couple of years. And, it's also said, like, budgets might be cut and there's a whole chill running through it. And the piece I wrote today is about how that impacts New Zealand, because I think it does have an impact on our local industry too. It was a few years ago that a TVNZ exec dismissed Netflix as a fad, which I think has demonstrably been proven wrong. But the thing that is relevant to us is that I think a lot of online stuff has been, there's this underlying assumption that it will grow forever. And what we've seen over the past year is, Facebook has had its first down quarter too, and between the slowing, and tapering off user growth plus changes to Apple's privacy settings meant that Facebook suddenly went from being a company that could do no wrong financially at least, to one which is really struggling there. And I think what we're seeing is obviously Facebook has a whole bunch of other issues. It's proven incapable of properly moderating its platforms, and just the general sentiment towards it has diminished a lot. And I think that naturally the social platforms, and I'll talk about that when we get to Twitter shortly, there's an issue, I think, in terms of how do these products make you feel? Yes, you want to get on them. They're very Moorish, but how do they make you feel? But getting back to New Zealand and TVNZ in particular, what the digital platforms sold to us was this idea that they would grow forever, and that as people came online, as people spent more and more time online, they would naturally spend more and more time on these platforms. But what we've seen in recent years, like post-pandemic really, is that our behaviours have got, less monolithic. So TikTok as a phenomenon barely existed 2-3 years ago. Now it's an incredibly important part of behaviours, particularly for Gen Z, and that's really challenging. There is a lot that's very confronting about that as a platform. It's really hard for the likes of the big media companies to play on TikTok, because it is the most explicitly creator-driven and creator-owned space out of all of the big social platforms. So we are currently merging RNZ and TVNZ to create a new public entity, the whole point of which is to go and reach that younger audience, the one that hasn't been well served by RNZ and TVNZ, which are dominated still by broadcast radio and linear television, respectively, in terms of what they create and the amount of time spent engaging with it by their audiences. If Netflix has reached a kind of ceiling, and if the streaming world is at capacity, and if new audience behaviours are actually going to be a lot more complex and a lot more, Discord and TikTok and, video chatting and messaging and, like a whole raft of behaviours, then they are consuming big budget produced audio and video products, that really will have profound implications over what should be made. And the skill sets of the TVNZ and RNZ organisations is still around making audio and video. So how does that impact when young people in particular are really gravitating towards super niche interests created by individuals as opposed to institutions which are creating much broader products? I think one thing that we still don't acknowledge enough in this country is that when someone switches from an old media world to a newer media world, they go from consuming probably north of 60-70% New Zealand created content to, well, we'll never know the true number, but if I had to guess, I would be surprised if it was anywhere near even 20% New Zealand content. So if you go from listening to the radio, which, the data is mixed, but supposedly about 1 in 5 songs on radio is from a New Zealand artist. On Spotify, we don't have the number, but I would be shocked if it was anywhere near that number, because we're able to, it goes from a lean back experience where someone else decides what you watch to a lean forward experience where you decide, or where a big playlist that you follow, which might be made anywhere in the world, is very unlikely to have any New Zealand content. That's the globalized media marketplace that we live in. So for those, the newly appointed establishment board for TVNZ and RNZ, creating a public entity to inform and entertain this vast, 50% of this country that's under the age of 40, these underserved audiences, particular communities that haven't been well served by our public media historically, good luck. And this Netflix story, it impacts them in a really profound way too. The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to oOh!media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spinoff. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
I also want to talk briefly about Elon Musk buying Twitter. It's been just an amazing thing to watch, like the sort of, everything Elon Musk does has this very kind of cinematic quality to it. And he's always sort of, the libertarian in him is always joyously breaking rules and sort of daring anyone to kind of stand in his way. So he was late in announcing that he'd taken the stake. He initially called it a passive shareholding when, a 10% stake in something as a passive shareholder, that's, even for the richest man in the world, that's a big call. He's appointed to the board for a matter of hours and then announces a takeover bid with a weed reference in it. And the board tries, which famously doesn't use Twitter and doesn't own any Twitter shares, tries to put in place a poison pill to stop him acquiring it because he doesn't have financing in place. He gets financing in place, and then the whole thing just collapses, and suddenly, they basically accepted the takeover offer. Now, there's a lot of things that have to go under the bridge, but the hardest ones are done. And I'm sure many of our listeners, if you're on Twitter, you probably have a complicated relationship with it. I was on it for 15 years. I recently left because I think I just sort of I found that I wasn't my best self there, and I didn't feel like my friends who were there, I didn't really recognize them when they were there, and I don't know, I just didn't love all that. But the other reason was like, Twitter has never been a great driver of traffic to any media company. That's our sort of stated reason for being there, is we sort of build these brands and we can distribute our work as journalists. That's for journalists. Everyone has their own reasons. But I used to joke about it just felt weird doing volunteer work for a billionaire, and that's basically what you're doing when you're on Twitter. If you frame it a particular way, is like you're creating content for, at the time it was Jack Dorsey. Now it's the world's richest man and someone who basically hates you. For a lot of people who are on Twitter who are, very passionate about particular causes, Elon Musk isn't passionate about those causes. And so I think there's a real kind of quandary about how that's going to play out. The other thing is I don't know that it won't be, in the longer term, good for the service. Twitter famously doesn't ship product very well. It hasn't grown as a business. It basically, when he announced his takeover bid, it was at basically the same price it had listed at nearly a decade earlier, when every other big technology or social stock had grown massively. So, what we have with Twitter is a company that is hugely influential, that politicians and identities from all kinds of communities are very prominent on, but that, to my mind, the algorithm of Twitter is as consequential as the algorithm of Facebook in terms of pushing society to its extremes. And that's, I don't think it's all that complicated. There isn't any incentive. There's no button that says, I basically agree with this take. There's no incentive to create that. The algorithm isn't going to surface a tweet where people just sort of nod without a huge amount of passion at it. It drives retweets and faves. It wants you to create content which generates reactions, just as Facebook does. And I think that for people who are extremely online, who are extremely on Twitter, particularly journalists and politicians, it kind of pushes you towards those fringes, and it sort of makes you feel like to participate in this conversation, you have to find a little toehold on the edge to sort of make headway or be seen. And I don't think that's been good for society. I don't think it's been good for Twitter as a product. There was a perspective I read from Ben Thompson, who runs the Stratechery newsletter, which I thought was really interesting, about Twitter. One of Twitter's many innovations in its early days was this open API, where any number of people could plug into that and give you a different version of Twitter, which is where sort of TweetDeck and Twitterific and a lot of apps which might not even be with us, a lot of them, they were sort of built off and around that at the time. And the business model of Twitter changed to be all about advertising, therefore it cut access off to those people. And one of the things that Ben Thompson suggested was, if they could just, if you could provide a different version of Twitter that might have no advertising, might put the feed into, whether it's strictly chronological, it might filter out particular things, and you paid for access to that, and users could either could buy access to it themselves, create it as a subscription product, as Netflix previously knew. Subscription products get very high valuations. There is a world where Elon Musk, who, whatever you think of him, is a genius of product and a guy who knows how to do very difficult things. A lot of his public statements around Twitter have been pretty asinine and somewhat scary, but ultimately $45 billion, you don't want to just set it on fire and pour it into the ground. I think the chance of him doing something different that isn't about advertising, and he said explicitly he wants to piss off the 10% of users on the left and the right. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, even if he's a scary individual, and most of what he said on a lot about this and about a whole bunch of other things is kind of scary. I think that there's a chance that this comes out to the good. So that's my monopod. Like I said, I'm going to try and do them periodically when big news strikes. I want to thank Tahe Butler for gamely stepping into the studio and putting this out, and Jane Yee for allowing me to do it, and you particularly for listening. If you like The Fold, please give it a rate on Apple or Spotify. Cheers.
The Fold is brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network together with Vodafone. It was hosted by Duncan Grieve, produced by Tahe Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee. To find out how Vodafone can help you reach your personal and business potential, visit vodafone.co.nz.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.